know most of you, maybe all of you were here last week, so you'll know about the background, who we are as CMI and so on. But however, I'm actually going to drop one or two things in about CMI resources as they link back to this. All right, so the flood, dinosaurs, and other incredible things. Okay, this is a big topic, isn't it? How do we deal with the flood? What about dinosaurs and these things around the idea of being a biblical account of history, I believe. So again, I'm here representing my wife Desma. She's here this week. So it's great to be back. We're representing Creation Ministries. And as I said last week, we're here to support the effective proclamation of the gospel. So what I'm sharing about science, about creation, evolution, about dinosaurs and the ark, that's all important, but the focus is on Jesus and the gospel. And you'll see why there is actually some strong parallels in what we're talking about today that actually have a gospel impact. Okay, so I mentioned again last week, and I want to really reinforce this again. I'm going to be going through lots of stuff fairly quickly, but our resource on the table, but also creation.com is a really important resource for you to go along, to be able to search and to dig deep on the things I'm talking about fairly superficially today. But I also mentioned last week about our InfoBytes email. I covered it fairly quickly, but today we'd just like to give you the opportunity, if you'd like to, just connect with us through InfoBytes. Desmond's going to just pop the clipboards around. It's very, very simple to sign up. But you'll see this is an example. It touches on what I'm going to be talking about today. This is a typical InfoBytes header. You get your InfoBytes, you open it up. Oh, here's Dr. Mark Harwood, who's a PhD scientist working in the aerospace industry. He's now retired, but he's a CMI speaker. He's one of my colleagues from Australia, a brilliant guy. And here he is talking about the earth cannot be old. I mean, the earth is old. We're talking, 100 times older than I am. But it's not, billions of years old if you look at the biblical account. But there's an example. See, we've actually got, there's the full article, the full video, which is about 45 minutes. And then you've got a short 40-second clip that goes onto TikTok and so on. And you've also got an article if you're a reader. So this is the sort of resource you get. It's a topic, there's a full-length video, a short video, and an article. So the clipboards are going to come around now. Very, very simple to fill in. Just your name, your email address, and your phone number. The phone number being there so that we can contact you if the email address has an issue. So while that's going around, I'd just like to mention too, huge thanks to Rob and Cheryl Aitken that they've actually invited us for lunch afterwards at their place. And so we're going to be there. It's just going to be a simple lunch, soup, buns, a salad, etc. Any of you who'd like to come along and have a chat, maybe ask some more questions or enjoy some fellowship and so on. So here's Rob over here. So please come and see him or Cheryl afterwards. I think anyone's welcome. I don't know what your capacity is. If you all come, that could be a problem, but... Okay. Great. So see them for details and the address and so on, but you're very, very welcome to come. So thank you for the offer. We're looking forward to it. Okay, so I also mentioned last week about the Creation Answers book. This is 60 of the most asked questions we get, including several things I'm talking about today, are covered in this little book. So it's a great resource for you. Okay, right, let's get back. This is God's Word, I believe. I know you do as well. This is, the Te Awamutu Bible Chapel. The Bible is obviously important to you. It's important to me. It's God's reference book, isn't it? And so we look at the cross-referencing in the Bible. It's an amazingly coherent book, 66 books written by about 40 authors over 1,600 years. Look at the linking and referencing within the Bible. Prophecy going forward, quotations going backwards. It's so beautifully integrated from Genesis 1 right up to Revelation 22. I think that's a hallmark of God alone, that the Holy Spirit's inspired all those human writers to write a book spanning all of history and pointing to Jesus, the Messiah. So I just want to focus on this big picture, because it's really important when we look at this whole idea of the age of the earth, the flood, and so on. So if we look at from Genesis 1 right through to Revelation 22, there's a very quick, sweeping account of history. So if we take the Bible's account as factual, all the history in Genesis, then we start to see creation in 6 ordinary days, a perfect creation, God resting on the 7th day, Adam and Eve made in God's image for identity and purpose and relationship with Him, and the stewardship of the planet given to them as a gift. Then, of course, the fall came. Adam and Eve rebelled, said, we want to run the show by ourselves. We want to be like God, as Satan tempted them. And that's when sin, death, bloodshed, and pain and suffering, thorns and thistles came in after the fall. And then, of course, we have 1,600 years later, we have God's judgment on an earth that was so corrupt he had to destroy basically all the humans and much of the life and vegetation during the flood. Therefore, the fossil record will be evidence of a global flood that completely reshaped and destroyed the earth. And then, again, after the flood, people began to multiply, but they stayed in one place. And then they began to build a tower. We'll be like God, building a tower to the heavens. And God said, no, I told you to spread out, to be fruitful, multiply, and enjoy my planet, my home that I made for you. But they rebelled, and so God judged them again. And they were separated by language and by family lines moving out from Babel, which is in the present-day Iraq. And they moved out from that carrying a subset of the genes from that original population. And then we get natural selection and adaptation over time, and we get the racial features we have today reinforced. It's good genetics. It makes good sense in so many ways. And then, of course, we get to Genesis chapter 12, and this character Abraham turns up, and God gave a promise to him. He will be a blessing, those who bless you. He's the father of the Israelites, leading the messianic line up to Jesus coming in due season as our Saviour, the Messiah, Yeshua. And then, of course, we have the church era after Jesus was crucified and rose again, right up to the new heavens and the new earth. So it's a huge sweeping panorama, isn't it, of account. That's the history of the Bible from Genesis 1 to Revelation 22. So what I'm going to share now, I just wanted to just touch on this in a very respectful way. Now, some people I know, many people I know, say, look, I love God, I love His Word, but science has really shown us that the Earth is billions of years old and evolution is a fact. So maybe you believe that, maybe you know people who believe that. I want to emphasize again, please, that if you feel that's a case you'd like to follow, that God is the creator, but He actually used the process of evolution to create. That's called theistic evolution, okay? So trying to merge the biblical account and the secular account of evolution and deep time together. So if we rewind and look at the Bible through that lens, we see a very different picture. So here we have billions of years from the Big Bang right through billions of years of hydrogen gas forming planets and so on. You see that vast amount of time. No humans, just the cosmos forming, maybe by God's direction. That's the idea. It's not secular. It's not undirected naturalism. God actually guided this process based on this worldview. But you still have billions of years from the Big Bang leading up over time. And then, of course, we end up with the flood. Well, we'll come to that in a minute. But how do we deal with the fossil record? So here we have the fossil record, a record of dead things buried in rock layers all around the world. So that must be the process of evolution. It's an evolutionary ascending order of complexity, deep time, millions of years of evolution to be recorded in the fossil record. So that means that has to go into there as well. Okay, and then of course we evolved from some original hominids a few million or a few 100,000 years ago. So there's us evolving from primitive hominids. Maybe God infused His Spirit into some selected hominids and Adam and Eve were real, but you still see huge amounts of deep time leading to us. So that's the account of deep time and origins. And then we move on, the rest of the Bible. Well, the account of the fall in Genesis chapter 3 is, well, that's maybe a spiritual model to show us our fallenness before God. They died spiritually, but, physical death has been around for billions of years. And then we move on to the flood. We move on to the flood, and maybe that was a myth or a children's story, but we can park that off as another metaphoric picture of a fallen world. And then Babel, well, that may or may not have been true. It may have been an account that was written down by the exiles in Babylon. We're not really sure how to deal with that either. And when we get to Abraham, now we're talking real history from then on. You see, so the whole 11 chapters of Genesis often have been moved into this idea of myth and metaphor. But what does this matter theologically? Well, in Genesis chapter 1, it talked about God creating everything. And on day 6, behold, God looked at everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. Very good. Which means basically perfect without corruption. So here's Adam and Eve in the garden. But if evolution was true, then the fossil record would have been under their feet. So you end up with millions of years of death, disease, and suffering before Adam and Eve turned up, before the fall. And God's calling all this very good. You can see what it does to the gospel. You know, if death is not the result of sin and the fall, why did Jesus have to come to pay a physical death? Without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins. So physical death and spiritual death were part of the fall. So it has a big impact upon the gospel itself and the character of God, the uniqueness of man, and also the credibility of Jesus, who believed, again, that from the beginning of creation, he created them male and female, and they then moved through from that. Romans 5 verse 12, it says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, Adam, a real person living at a real point in history, and death came in through sin, and so death spread to all mankind, all men, because all have sinned. So it tells us that death is actually not the way God created it. He didn't use a process that included death and suffering over millions of years. In 1 Corinthians 15, 25 and 26, it says, for he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. So if death is the last enemy, and yet under the evolutionary model, it's been around for billions of years, how can it be the last enemy? It's always been here. Okay, so I just want to leave that with you. I really pray that you just take it on board, think about it, pray about it, and hopefully what I'm going to share now will actually start to give you some outline about why the Bible's account of history makes so much more sense scientifically as well. So I mentioned last week about the two kinds of science, operational, observational science, that happens in the present, observing, testing, and repeating, and then, of course, historical science for studying things like my fossil. So I talked about that last week. So again, reinforcing, this is a repeat from last time, that it's not about science versus faith, it's about one history versus another history. Okay, so as we move through the next stages, I'd like you to look at each thing and say, which history makes more sense? You know, slow and gradual, millions of years, or something catastrophic happening, especially around the flood. So where did this idea of millions of years, this philosophy come into the world, into science and into the church? Well, it primarily happened through the Enlightenment, but this gentleman here, James Hutton, he lived in the late 1700s, and he was a Scottish farmer, but also an amateur geologist. He loved studying rocks and so on. And he and his friends sailed around the coast of Scotland looking at the rock layers. And we've actually got a tract about this called Sychar Point. That's one of the things. He looked at all these contorted rock layers and he went, these haven't changed much since I was a child. And up on Hadrian's Wall on the English-Scottish border, he said, they haven't changed much since the Roman times. So things must wear down really slowly and sediment builds up really slowly. It must take millions or billions of years. So he came up with this idea of the present is the key to the past. The things we measure today, that's the way it's always been for billions of years. And that's called uniformitarianism, which is the underlying lens that secular science is done by. So when they pick up a fossil, they pop on their uniformitarian glasses, slow and gradual, millions of years. That's the lens that they interpret all the rock layers and so on through that lens. It's not actually scientific, it's a philosophy or a worldview. All right, so one of the last rules I want to just mention again in relation to subscriptions and so on is our Creation Mag. And I mentioned that last week. Really, really encourage you to think about this. We're not going to pass the clip rules around for this one, but they're available out the back. Come and have a look at it. We'd love you to subscribe and join in, 4 times a year, a brilliant family-friendly magazine. Plus, of course, a digital subscription as well that will enable you to share it with up to 5 different devices. So that's the little sign-up sheet. Come and see us afterwards. Fill out whether you'd like 1, 2, or 3-year sub. Fill out your details, and then if you're getting a gift sub for somebody, fill out your details on the front, and then fill their details out on the back. And what we do is we send them a letter saying, so-and-so has gifted you a magazine, and when it arrives, they don't go, what's this about? Oh, yes, I'm expecting it. All right, so I just wanted to move into the flood. The flood's really important, and when that's the key of what we're talking about today, the flood, the Genesis flood. Okay. Now, by the way, you'll see out on the foyer there's a scale model of Noah's Ark. So I'm not going to cover the Ark in detail in this talk, but we'd love for you to look at it, think about it, and we've got some great resources on the table about the Ark, is it credible, and the flood itself. So we've got some decisions to make about the flood. Okay, the Bible talks about the flood. 3 whole chapters of Genesis, chapters 6 to 8, describe the flood in detail. And of course, the New Testament writers also mentioned the flood multiple times, including Jesus. So we have a choice. Was it complete and utter myth, a children's fairy tale? Or maybe, as they thought in the old days, it was a global flood, but it filled up like a bathtub, just filling up, a tranquil flood, filling up and slowly draining away, leaving just some mud and salt around the place. Very, very gentle and tranquil, which is actually ridiculous, that one. And then local, maybe a local flood, a real flood, catastrophic flood, but maybe it was local to the Black Sea area in Mesopotamia or somewhere like that. Or, as the Bible says, it was a catastrophic and global flood that completely wrecked Earth and caused huge amounts of geological work, death and destruction for basically around a year. Now, Noah is also mentioned 59 times in the Bible as a real historical figure with spiritual connections. There's many links back to Noah and the account of as in the days of Noah. You know, Jesus talked about that in the end times, as in the days of Noah. Peter talked about as in the days of Noah. And Peter talked in detail. Only 8 people survived. The world that was then was destroyed by water. So the New Testament writers believed the account of the flood and Noah as real history. So if the flood was real and it globally affected the whole earth, then it should leave a lot of evidence behind for us to see, shouldn't it? If you've got something that big that the whole earth has been reshaped, uplifted, eroded, and so on, we should see a lot of evidence that the flood was global and catastrophic. But many people deny the flood as a whole. In 2 Peter 3, 5 and 6, he talks about this. For they deliberately overlook this fact. Notice the word deliberately. Because if the flood was real, God's judgment was real, therefore the Bible is credible, which means there's a God I have to deal with. I have to acknowledge there's a God. I don't want to go there. I don't want God telling me what to do. So we push back spiritually because of our fallen nature. We don't want God supposedly taking control of my life. So we deliberately overlook the evidence that the heavens existed long ago and the earth was formed out of water, not a hot molten blob, but out of water, through water by the word of God, and that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. So there's actually a spiritual reason why people will deny the evidence for the flood, even though it is so plain to see. So I just want to touch on, again, pretty quickly about the flood. Could it be just a local event, one that affected the Mesopotamian area a few thousand years ago? So what's some reasons why a local flood does not stack up biblically or scientifically or even logically? So if the flood was local, I'm talking about a big flood but local to that area, why did Noah spend decades building a huge ark, 150 meters long, this massive thing, and animals being brought to it and so on? Why was it so big? You know, why couldn't the animals and people just migrate over the nearest mountain range and get away? There's no need to spend 70 to 100 years building a massive wooden vessel, bringing animals and birds to it. So that's a major reason. And birds and so on. And the flood, no local flood ever lasts that long, basically a year. There's no known flood that's ever lasted that long. And how could the waters rise to cover the mountains of that time, up to 8 meters above the highest mountains? Water finds its own level. If it starts to fill, it will flow around valleys and so on. You can't cover the highest mountains in a local area or globally without having a massive amount of water. Now, we haven't got time to talk about where did all the water come from and where did it go, but our Answers book has got a great chapter about where did the water come from and where did it go. And I can tell you, as a small spoiler, Mount Everest was not around before the flood. And there's also excellent geological evidence that all the major mountain ranges, the Andes, even our Southern Alps, the Rockies, all these mountains, the Himalayas especially, were pushed up by massive tectonic movements during the flood. There's great evidence for that, and we've got some good resources to show. So the water didn't have to fill up to cover Mount Everest, okay? That is not a biblical or a historical account. And why would the ark actually land on a high mountain area? As things drain off, they tend to drift floating objects down to low levels onto beaches and deltas. And this is the key one. God would have repeatedly broken his promise never to flood the earth again. There's been heaps of major floods, isn't there? You know, from like even Cyclone Gabriel, that's a tiny flood compared to some. In Africa and in Asia, you see these huge floods causing much destruction over and over again, over all these centuries. Is God a liar when he promised, I'll never again bring a flood to destroy the earth? So that's a major theological reason. And of course, people who didn't live locally would have escaped judgment. They wouldn't have died in God's judgment. And a partial judgment in Noah's day means a partial judgment to come, as it talks about in Peter. Okay, so the local flood does not stack up for many, many reasons. All right, so again, this next slide I'm going to show you, I say it with respect, but you see many pictures of the ark depicted in children's books and children's Bibles and so on that looks a bit like this. It's cute, isn't it? Really cute. But even subconsciously, not deliberately, but subconsciously, it just reinforces the idea that you've got this totally little round, tubby boat, unstable as anything, a couple of giraffes sticking out the top, you know, totally ridiculous and untenable. So I'm respectfully saying maybe we should just do that, okay? It's really just a children's fairy tale. No. The real ark, as I mentioned, is 300 cubits long. That's about 140 metres long, 1.5 rugby fields long. And you'll see there the red arrow on the side, that's people for scale. So you're talking a seriously large vessel, just a box. That's what the ark means. It's like a box, a place of shelter. It had no engine, had no sails, no rudder. It just had to drift and not tip over. And it's an incredibly stable design. If you look at the dimensions, length, width and height, most modern bulk carriers, oil tankers are built to those dimensions. Very, very stable. So how did some ancient shepherds in the Middle East know how to design a ship or a box of those dimensions? I think it's a divine design, isn't it? And people say, oh, you can't build a wooden boat that big, it will just twist and fall apart. Well, the Romans and the Chinese built ships around that size as well. So there's good accounts for historical, from other cultures, of ships of about that size that were built and were fine. Yes, it obviously has to be well designed with lots of bracing, but there's no reason why it could not actually be made to those dimensions. But I also want to mention that there was a supernatural content to the flood itself. You know, God gave Noah the design. He brought the animals to Noah. Noah didn't have to run out and try to catch them. And God closed the door and he protected. He would have provided protection for them over that year. And we've got some great resources about why the account of the ark, the account of the animals and Noah and his family is very, very credible. Plus, of course, there's a supernatural protection and aspect to it. Right, another reason why the account of the flood seems to be so embedded into our culture right around the world is there are over 500 legends in many, many cultures about a global flood. You know, they vary over time. Maybe the big spirit gets angry and there's a flood, and then, you know, a kangaroo goes onto a raft with some people, and, you know, there's all these different ideas, but the common thread right through many, many cultures, including Fiji, Aboriginal people in Australia, people in Africa, the Native Americans, they have this idea of a global flood, some sort of judgment from the spirits, and some people surviving out of it. If it goes back to our common knowledge through Babel and before that, back to the flood and Noah, it makes so much sense that many, many widely different cultures should understand and of something of a global flood. And again, I haven't got time to go into detail, but the Ice Age is actually incredibly well explained by the flood itself. If you just slowly cool Earth down due to Milankovitch cycles or other long-term 45, 100,000 year cycles, if you slowly cool the Earth down, you don't get an Ice Age. You just get a dry, cold Earth. To have an Ice Age, you've got to actually have two conditions. One is lots and lots of precipitation, lots and lots of snowfall and rain onto the land, and also during the summer, the ice not melting back much. And so the flood would have caused huge amounts of tectonic uplift, volcanisms, continents being rammed up to each other, warmer oceans, and of course volcanic dust in the atmosphere, blocking out sunlight, causing the land to be colder during the summers. So over even just a few centuries, you get thick, heavy snowfall, and the ice sheets growing very, very rapidly over hundreds of years. and there's great evidence all around the world this is the case. But also remember that even at the peak of the Ice Age, only about a third of the Earth's surface was in ice. The rest in the tropics and the other latitudes were very, very richly watered. So the Sahara and Central Australia once were lush and green. Again, a great outcome of this sort of world with warm oceans, much precipitation, and the ice sheets forming. So again, the Ice Age is well explained by the flood. And also the other thing was it actually lowered the sea up to 110 metres down. Again, no one disputes that. The sea levels were much, much lower in the past, which would have opened up land bridges between different areas, allowing animals to migrate after the flood and the centuries after the flood. As the populations began to move out, people and animals would have moved into North America and down and all around the place through these land bridges as well. Now, what about rocks? We want to look at some geology. The evidence for the flood is everywhere. This is a great example. So we're looking at flat rocks, or flat gaps rather, paraconformities they're called. Now I was fortunate to be able to travel in the Grand Canyon where that photo was taken back in 2014. So I spent 9 days hiking and rafting in the Grand Canyon with Canyon Ministries. It was an incredibly special time for me. You know, I'm a keen outdoors guy. So if anyone would like to do that, I encourage you to go onto Canyon Ministries and book a trip to go to the States and do that canyon trip. It's awesome. There's also rim trips and other ones that are easier, but this was really, really worthwhile. And that's the photo I actually took. So that red rock there is called the Hermit Shale. It's like a fairly soft red mudstone. And above that is the Coconino Sandstone, which is a very, very different kind of rock. But we're told, again, that there are actually 10 to 12 million years of missing time. So that flat gap there, that's almost as flat as this floor. And these rock layers go out for hundreds of thousands of square kilometres. It's not just local to the Grand Canyon. They go right out through Nevada and Utah and right out. And again, this absolutely billiard table flat contact point. And we see this all around the world, these flat gaps where there's rock layer and it changes to a very, very different rock layer with no erosion between the rock layers. So where's the actual evidence for 10 to 12 million years of missing time? Why is there no erosion, no cracking, no sign of soil or trees or anything like that? It's just absolutely been planed off. Of course, the flood, you have all this huge amounts of erosion, ripping up rock and grinding it down, bringing slurries from one place, and then the water drains away with tidal movements, and then as the water comes back up from a different area, bringing sediment from a different region, you see these layers being layered up, layer after layer, very quickly in a period of days or weeks. It makes great sense to believe the flood account of the Bible. What about folded rocks? That's another great example here. So here's a road cutting in Canada where they sliced through a mountain. Look at all those rock layers. All, again, no erosion between the rock layers, and then the whole lot has been folded up, and it's then set into solid rock after it was folded. And you can tell by the lack of cracking in the rock that it was all still soft and wet, not heated or melted. It was actually soft and wet when it was all folded. And then, of course, we only see the erosion really on the surfaces, don't we? This, to me, is powerful evidence for a global flood doing huge amounts of geological work, including uplift and erosion, a few thousand years ago. And coal. I know coal is a bit of a dirty word these days, isn't it? You know, with lots of different reasons. But coal is actually a great testimony to the flood itself. So all around the world, we have these thick coal seams with often very, very pure layers of sediment between them. And yet, a great example of this is in... I'm not sure where that is, Pennsylvania, I think it was. But yes, look at that coal, very, very pure coal with very, very pure sediment between it, flat as a pancake. And also, interestingly, we find carbon-14 in coal samples all around the world. So firstly, that's a major issue for evolution, and it's a really good confirmation of the biblical account and time frame. So all the pre-flood vegetation being ripped up and washed into basins and then covered up with thick layers, hundreds or thousands of meters of sediment pressed down, heated with geological heat, with chemicals there. You can make coal very, very quickly with the right conditions. We can show that in the lab. And so this is a great example of the pre-flood vegetation being compressed and turned into coal. And yet carbon-14 is found in basically all coal samples at every depth at about the same amounts. And carbon-14 should have disappeared completely in about 100,000 years. Yet we find measurable C14 and at the same amounts everywhere. If they were millions of years different, they wouldn't be the same ratios as carbon-14 breaks down quickly. Something to think about. Now, the last one geologically is what we call collapsing landforms. This is great evidence again for the flood. So all around the world we get these beautiful postcard or calendar grade photos. I'm not sure if anyone's been to any of these places. That one down the bottom there is actually on the south coast of Australia. It's called the 12 Apostles. Now, if you haven't been there, I've not been there, you need to be quick because they keep falling apart. There's only 7 left now. And all around the world we see these geological structures just collapsing and falling apart. Up the top there you'll see these amazing bridges and Arches in Arches National Park in the USA. There's about 2,000 arches and bridges in that park, and 43 have collapsed since 1971. So in 50 years, you've lost about 5% of all the arches in that area. Yet we're told these are hundreds of millions of years old, slow, gradual whittling away by time and wind. It makes much more sense to me. These are remnants of the the post-flood area as the water's drained off the continent, stripping away sediment, leaving all these eroded features. They settle to solid rock, and yes, then the erosion rates drop to the levels we measure today. So the present is not the key to the past. There was a catastrophic origin, and now a slow and gradual whittling away to now. So these things cannot be hundreds of millions of years old. The fact they're even here. Now this is one thing I came across recently. Anyone been to Ireland? Yeah, this is a very famous place. It's called Dunbrist, which means a broken fort. And it is, you see again the layers of rock, layer after layer of very flat rock with no erosion between each layer. Yet we're told this is about 350 million years old, those rock layers. Well, this is an interesting thing. It's about 45 metres high, and it's now 228 metres away from the headland, the mainland. And there's a picture of it from the side with a person for scale. So how long do you think it took for that to be eroded away so that you had a 228 metre gap between the headland and the rock? Any guesses how long that would have taken? Here we go. Well, we know from historical accounts, it was joined up to the mainland until 1393. So in 600 years, it's eroded about 750 feet, 228 metres of rock is gone. Now, certainly there would have been a bridge which would have collapsed, would have sped it up, but we see all around the world coastal erosion is very, very rapid. There's parts of the UK where there are Roman villages 2 kilometres away from the shore, and you see these cliffs eroding. So if these continents have been there for millions of years, they would have disappeared a long time ago. They cannot be that old, even at the rates we measure today. So we've got a couple of resources about geology and so on, deep time and where it came from, and also the flood. This is a great book covering the flood and the ark in detail. So again, I'll try to quickly go through the fossils and then finish up with dinosaurs. So I come back to the fossil again because it's really important about, when we look at the fossil record, is it a record of death and judgment during the flood, or is it a record of millions of years of evolution? So we're told that fossils form slowly and gradually. So something dies in the ocean, on land, it's covered up with sediment slowly, the bones become mineralized, and you end up with a fossil. Over millions of years, you get uplift, you get erosion, and we dig it up and we find it. Seems credible? I could believe that. I used to believe that. It makes sense. Something gets buried, covered up slowly, mineralized over millions of years, and forms a fossil. But if we look at the world around us and we say, something dies in the open, like here's a great example. I think it's off Rio in South America. If we went back a few weeks or months later, what would we actually find here? A bad smell? Yeah, lots of happy seagulls, wouldn't there be? But basically it's all gone, isn't it? When things die in the open, they're scavenged, they rot, they fall apart, and they disappear very, very quickly. Even something as big as a whale, we now know within 80 to 100 years, a whale's gone, skeleton, everything. That's why you never find skeletons in shipwrecks or plane crashes. Things that die in the open disappear very, very quickly. They're dissolved in seawater, in salt water, and so on. So that's a bit awkward, isn't it? I've done some scuba diving and I've seen nature shows. You don't see these dead things lying around here in rivers and lakes and oceans. So where are all these bodies coming from to form our fossil record? So when you find a fossil, something had to be buried very, very quickly to ever become a fossil at all. So a small trigger warning here. This could be disturbing. This is Freddy the fish. He's a great little guy here, swimming along, enjoying his day, and suddenly there's a great slurry of mud, silt, and sand wash out across the sea floor, smothering poor little Freddy. And yes, Freddy is dead, but you'll see he's now covered up with thick layers of sedimentary material under pressure, and he's basically protected from scavengers, from oxygen, bacteria. and he's in a perfect place to begin the fossilization process, which we now know, again, from operational science, can happen very, very quickly in a period of just a few months or years. It does not take millions of years to fossilize something in the right conditions. Okay, so whenever something is buried, it had to be, whenever something is fossilized, it had to be buried very quickly to be fossilized at all. Some famous examples very quickly is like a fish eating another fish. Look at the detail, no sign of scavenging, rotting, the bones aren't disarticulated and so on. And this female ichthyosaur here, look at the detail that she's been preserved in. We know it's a female because of Les Jr. Look at the detail, no sign of any decay or scavenging. And of course, the bigger the creature, if you get a dinosaur, an elephant or something, a really big creature needs many, many meters or even hundreds of meters of sediment in which to ensure it doesn't sort of float and bloat and pop up again. So to fossilize something really big, you have to have huge amounts of sediment. And some of these fossil graveyards are vast, aren't they? Millions of creatures all buried, thickly covered with rock. So yeah, the fossil record is a great testimony to the flood and God's judgment. So God is a holy God, but he had to bring a judgment upon a sinful world. So we should be looking at the flood and going, well, Lord, thank you that you've given us a way out through Jesus. All right, so dinosaurs, I'll finish off with that. You've been all waiting for dinosaurs. So what about dinosaurs? How do we deal with dinosaurs? These are interesting creatures, very, very popular with things like Jurassic Park and so on. So dinosaurs basically were, because they're extinct, air-breathing, land-dwelling animals made on day 6 in Genesis. We'll talk about those. The difference between they are reptiles, but they're not lizards. You can tell by the actual things like lizards and so on, crocodiles, they have their legs splayed out, so you'll see the bones of those, whereas dinosaurs had column legs in that way. So dinosaurs were reptiles, but they weren't lizards. If we get things like pterosaurs and mosasaurs and so on, they weren't dinosaurs, they were just flying or swimming reptiles. Okay, so dinosaurs, by definition, are air-breathing, land-dwelling reptiles. So, of course, the question is, when did the word dinosaur first appear? We call them dinosaurs, that's the thing we are used to. And the word dinosaur doesn't appear in the Bible as the word dinosaur. So when did the word first appear? So here we have a dinosaur, theropod. Well, it was actually coined in 1841 by this gentleman here, Sir Richard Owen, and he found some huge bones in the UK, and he coined this term dinosaur, which means terrible lizard, even though they weren't lizards. That was the name he gave. So dinosaur means terrible lizard, and that's the name where the name started. So before then, what do you reckon they called dinosaurs when they found them, bones or whatever? Yeah, I think you're exactly, dragons. Even in Encyclopedia Britannica before 1841, they talked about sea dragons and land dragons. So this idea of these huge creatures that lived in the past, based on the fossil record, they called them dragons. That's interesting, isn't it? Dragons, we hear a lot more in history and in the Bible as well about dragons and Behemoth and Leviathan and so on. But is there evidence, if the Bible's account is true, dinosaurs and humans by definition must have lived together? Adam and Eve, there would have been dinosaurs and back in then and after the flood and so on. I've got dinosaurs going into the ark there to get you thinking. So what about different cultures that show links to dinosaur or dragon-like creatures, dinosaur-like creatures in their time? Here's a great little example. In China, 2000 BC, this little jade carving here. So if we look at the fossil record, it's a fairly interesting shape, isn't it? We don't know for sure, but it seemed possibly that was what we call a Centrosaurus. Was that something they had in that area and they recorded, they carved? And many, many cultures have this idea of tapestries and legends and statues and carvings and paintings about dinosaur-like creatures that seem to be explained best by the dinosaurs being in that local area thousands or hundreds of years ago. We also have, of course, the Chinese zodiac. So here we have the creatures going right round. They're all, things like horse and snake, ox, rat, pig. They're all creatures that still live today, don't they? There's only one that's missing, and that, of course, is the dragon. So why would you have 11 real animals and one that's mythical? Maybe that was, a distorted over time of creatures that really lived back in those days. And, of course, whales, they have, a very stylistic, very distorted, but a picture of a dinosaur-like creature, a dragon. that's embedded in their culture and their flag as well. And lastly, of course, we talk about evidence for dinosaurs living in more recent times than millions of years ago, because the standard model is that a meteorite landed, wiped out all the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. That's what we hear, don't we? It's in textbooks, it's in kids' programs, it's in Jurassic Park, it's in science media, it's in curricula for university. 66 million years ago, dinosaurs got wiped out. Well, that's a little bit awkward because my wife Desma, she works in a vet lab and is dealing with animal blood all the time. And this particular finding, she's looked at the slide and gone, yeah, this is interesting. So dinosaur soft tissues is a major issue for the millions of years in the standard model of history. So here's a famous example, Dr. Mary Schweitzer, a very qualified paleontologist living in the States. And back in the 1990s, they were in Montana, and they found this huge T-Rex, Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton that was in very good condition. So they, this is good, we'll take it out and study it and restore it. So as they took the skeleton out piece by piece, they came across the femur, the thigh bone. That was just too big to lift out in one piece in the helicopter, so they cut it in half. When they opened up this massive bone, the centre was slightly smelly, it was slightly squishy, and it wasn't fossilised in the middle. This is amazing. They took it back to the lab, and Dr. Schweitzer, being a good scientist, they took sections of the material, put it under a microscope, and they were shocked. They said, I got goosebumps. It was exactly like looking at a slice of modern bone. But of course, I couldn't believe it. You see the philosophy, the lens, the set of glasses she had on? I said to the lab technician, the bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How can blood cells last that long? Well, Desma would say, they can't. Well, these are obviously very degraded, but Desma said that these are actually still recognisable as reptilian blood cells. It's amazing, isn't it? So we just know from standard science, from physics and chemistry, soft tissues, complex biomolecules cannot last that long. Even to say they'll last back to the flood a few thousand years ago is amazing. How can they last that long? But 65 million years is actually 16,000 times longer than the time back to the flood. We just know it's impossible for things to last that long. But the millions of years are never questioned, because if the millions of years are wrong, then evolution fails, and therefore we have to deal with creation, isn't it? If evolution doesn't stack up, so they will never let go of the millions of years, because evolution needs deep time to be credible. But it gets worse now because they're finding many unfossilized or partially fossilized dinosaur remnants around the world. They're finding stretchy tissues, collagens, osteocytes, still squishy and stretchy. And so this is a major issue for the standard model of millions of years. So yeah, dinosaurs, we call them missionary lizards. There's great examples around the world of this. And the book of Job talks about Behemoth, whose tail was like a cedar tree. Now, some Bibles said that Behemoth was like a hippopotamus or an elephant. Well, an elephant has just like a little string tail, just a little strap hanging down, and a hippopotamus is just a little flap, isn't it? Try and get a flap. Like a cedar tree? No. But you get a big sauropod dinosaur, that adds up. You've got a tree-like tail on those huge dinosaurs. So there's good evidence in history and in fossils and also in the Bible of dinosaurs living alongside humans until a few centuries ago. So we've got some really good books about dinosaurs. This is a fairly recent one called Titans, and it goes into detail about what dinosaurs are, about the history of paleontology and how people have come up with these ideas. And this one here is a really popular book. It's called Dire Dragons, and it talks about these historical accounts from many cultures right around the world of dinosaur or dragons around the world that link back to human habitation. And I mentioned last week about 6 days, a great little one-off for young people, taking Creation Magazine articles and bundling them for young people and young adults to read. And lastly, I want to reinforce this again, the Creation Survival Guide for young people who are going to university especially. I talked last week about many young people struggle with their faith once they leave home and go out into secular education to travel or go flatting. This is a great book to give to your loved ones to help them to do well, to study well, and not lose their faith. And also the free tracks out there. I found that I need to get some more stocks of certain titles. Happy to get some more and give them to Shane later on if we run out today. This is a great free resource for you to enjoy and to share around. And lastly, one last plug, please, for our Waikato Creation and Apologetics Camp, which is coming up this Friday, this coming weekend. It's not too late to register if you'd like to come. I know that some here have expressed interest last week. It's at Karakariki, which is not far from Hamilton, going out past Whatawhata. So from Friday night through to Sunday afternoon, we've got some flyers on the table out there. There's a website, cmihamilton.nz. Please spread the word. You're very, very welcome. There's still room for you. And we'd love to come out. We've got 4 of us as speakers covering a whole range of topics from scientific to theological, testimony, credibility of the Bible, plus a field trip to Karakariki Track. We'd love you to join in to that. All right, so lots thrown out, but please look at our resources, look at our website, pray about it, think about it, and I hope it's been helpful to you.